Firstly, this idea that the alternative vote will give more say to people. Quite the opposite. It'll end up giving more say to politicians because it will lead to more hung parliaments in which the third party will be able to hold the sway of power and decide who they form a government with, whether that's the Conservative Party or the Labour Party or whoever in a hung parliament. It means that the decisions are made not by voters going to the ballot box, not at the end of an election campaign where we've had a national debate, but behind closed doors, in back rooms, by politicians, in isolation from the public. It'll lead to more broken promises, more U-turns, things like the Lib Dems tuition fees U-turn, which we've seen. These are part of the problem with politics today. This is part of the malaise that affects our political system, and a voting system that leads to more broken promises and more U-turns cannot be the solution that we need. Katie talked about competition and the idea that there are competition-free zones in seats around the country. Well, even on the alternative vote, the 217 constituencies where the Member of Parliament already has 50% of the vote, nobody would have a second preference. These would still be, under her judgment, a competition-free zone. Some people in certain seats would be able to cast more than one preference and have them counted, but in these 217 constituencies, nobody would. And actually, this idea of safe seats is a bit of a misapprehension. Michael Portillo had a seat with a huge majority, over 50% of the vote in 1992, lost it in 1997 because the voters there decided they no longer wanted him, they no longer wanted to make that a safe seat, and they got rid of him. Lembit Opik lost a seat in May, which he had with 50% of the vote, and was kicked out by the voters. Vera Baird, in Redcar, at the general election, a seat that the Electoral Reform Society confidently predicted before the election wouldn't change hands, changed hands on a huge swing because the local voters of Redcar were angry with their Member of Parliament and her inaction to deal with the closure of the Chorus steel plant. A safe seat is only a safe seat for as long as the voters there vote to make it so. I know this because I fought a seat at the last election that some people might describe as a competition-free zone, Newcastle upon Tyne North. Despite my best efforts, I came in 10,000 votes behind the Labour MP who won it. Newcastle North used to be a Conservative seat, a fairly safe Conservative seat. It had a Tory Member of Parliament for 26 years. Why was it the Conservative Party lost it? Not because of some trick of the electoral system, not because of some disadvantage, but because the party didn't work hard enough, because the party was saying the wrong things to the people of Newcastle, because people in Newcastle felt let down by what Margaret Thatcher and her governments did in the 1980s. Seats change hands not because of the voting system, but because of the failures of politicians. And if we tinker around with the system, we're letting politicians off the hook for the failures of policy. He talked about members of Parliament only being elected with the support of 3 out of 10 voters. It's quite curious because the preferred voting system of the Electoral Reform Society and a lot of people on the Yes campaign is the single transferable vote, which would make sure that nobody is elected with 50% of support. Everybody would be elected on a very small percentage because it would be exactly reflecting the way votes were cast. So it's quite a sort of curious totemic thing that they found about this 50% threshold. But that's because it's one of the few distinct things you can say about the alternative vote. And even that's not true. It's not really 50%. It's actually 50% of the votes still left in the count. Because if you vote for somebody who gets knocked out, or if you try and transfer your preference to somebody who's already been eliminated, then your vote no longer counts and is set aside. And the bar for what is 50% of the vote comes down. So you can end up with people still being elected on 30-something or 40-something percent of the vote, but with this artificial majority of 50%, which has been cobbled together by the 5th or 6th preferences of other party voters. And the Labour leadership contest, where Ed Miliband was elected on the 5th preferences, the 4th preferences of the 5th place candidate, show the dissatisfaction and the sort of the paltry mandate that can often result in. I was amused that Katie says that a lot of organisations use the alternative vote in their internal elections. What she didn't think to mention is that most of those are run by Electoral Reform Services Limited, the private wing of the Electoral Reform Society, and that stands even for the Conservative Party, so follow the money. The worst thing is, though, I think a lot of people on the Yes campaign, and I think even Katie, knows all this. She knows all the flaws. We know that because the Electoral Reform Society was originally founded as the Proportional Representation Society. Changed its name in the 50s, a long time before Katie was involved, but its policy has long been to bring in a proportional voting system. And a lot of the arguments that Katie outlined in her speech are arguments for a proportional system. But we know, because the ERS said when Gordon Brown first started talking about the alternative vote, that they don't think AV is an acceptable system. Because at the time, the Electoral Reform Society pointed out that AV is not a proportional system and can in fact be more disproportional than first past the post. So they know it doesn't really reflect the voice of the people. The ERS website used to say that AV does very little to improve the voice of traditionally unrepresented groups in Parliament, strengthening the dominance of the central viewpoint. So they know it won't create a more balanced or representative Parliament for our country. The ERS website used to say that there's no transfer of power from party authority to the voters. So they know it's not about empowering people, it's about empowering politicians. And they say, their website used to say that AV is prone to a certain amount of donkey voting, where voters rank candidates randomly, not knowing enough about all of them to make an informed decision. So they know that it's a complex and confusing system for a lot of the electorate. And that's why their website used to say, until this referendum came along, that as AV is not a proportional system, the society does not regard it as suitable for the election of a representative body, for example, a parliament. So why have they changed their tune so suddenly? Well, there are two assessments you could make. The first is a generous assessment that the ERS and a lot of people in the Yes campaign wish that they were having the referendum that they've long campaigned for, a referendum on the proportional voting system. But if so, I'm afraid they're misguided, because the alternative vote is not a reliable stepping stone to a proportional system. No country which uses PR got there via AV. In fact, most places who've tried the alternative vote have gone back to first past the post. 3 Canadian provinces used to use it, and in the 1950s got rid of it to return to first past the post. American cities like Aspen, Colorado, ditched it in a ballot during the midterms last year. Burlington in Vermont tried it, found that the candidate who came second on the first round went on to win, and they decided they'd ditch it. 6 out of 10 Australians want to get rid of the alternative vote and go back to a first-past-the-post system. And Fiji, one of the other 2 countries in the world that uses it, have plans to ditch it. But it's also misguided because, as the ERS website used to tell you, AV is even less proportional than first-past-the-post. In the 2005 election, a Labour lead of 3 points gave Tony Blair a majority of 66. Under AV, he would have had a majority of 108. So when people in the Yes campaign say this led to the expenses crisis and this led to the Iraq war and this leads to unfair outcomes, they should bear in mind that the alternative vote actually could make these problems even worse. And a less generous assessment, of course, is that a lot of people on the Yes side, and I don't count Katie amongst these, are motivated by partisan interest. Because the only one of the main parties that is backing the alternative vote is the Liberal Democrats. And that's because at the last election they know they'd have had another 32 seats. They know that their vote will their tally of members of Parliament will always be inflated because they can rely on being the second choice of the other 2 main parties more so than the others can. David Laws, speaking about the coalition negotiations, described the alternative vote as a shield against the unpopularity that we, the Liberal Democrats, would suffer. So he knows that AV is a way of digging the Lib Dems into government forever. 5 out of 6 members of the Yes Campaign Steering Committee have either worked for or explicitly supported the Lib Dems in the last 12 months. And as well as a lot of money from the Electoral Reform Society, the Yes Campaign is getting a lot of money from the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust, who are the largest donors to the Liberal Democrats. So we've got 86 days to have what I hope will be a better debate, focusing on the specifics of the alternative vote and not some sort of wish list, but also to address the issue that really is at stake. Because Katie is right, there's a lot of disillusionment out there. People are fed up with politics, and I heard it a lot on the streets in the last elections, but I didn't hear people complaining about the proportionality of our system or wanting to have a second vote. What I heard was, well, what's the point in voting? I'll vote for you, but you're all the same. It won't make any difference. And if we're not careful, we'll end up giving our country a system which leads to more broken promises, leads to more disillusionment, and makes that problem even worse. And that's why I hope that you'll join us in voting no on the 5th of May.